This is our second section in Unit 7. This is pretty much like the first part for the progressive heirs, a lot of the domestic policies. This is one of our shortest sections that we have all year. It's kind of a segue between, of some of the things that we had in the past and then finishing them up, and then a few things in the next section. There aren't a whole lot of direct standards that this is located on, but a lot of them that are directly with. For our bracketing dates are some things that occur in a certain date, but most of this is simply over a period of time, and especially focusing on the first 2 decades of the 1900s, but some of these things were coming before then. All right, broadside for the progressive movement, the reason for the reforms. And if you were an AP, we would be writing a lot of essays and going a lot more detail. I actually go pretty fast through this of just a quick summary of these, but the idea to protect social welfare, promote moral improvement, foster efficiency, economic reform. The efficiency side, we will hit more of that in Unit 8 there with Henry Ford, but there are some with government that will have moral improvement. You'll see that with like the 19th or the 18th Amendment with prohibition. Protect social welfare. We're going to have a lot of the things that are done on regulation of business, continuing what was done, but even more so, and this is what the muckrakers have. And then economic reform, we'll focus on the next part. The reforms that we have, it comes from a bunch of different things here. We have, this is a worldwide movement, and this is where the effects of Karl Marx's book with the Communist Manifesto, we had our own versions in America. We would not have communism take hold in America, but there will be the influences where we will have for the Communist and Socialist Party that in some, like one presidential election, getting over 10% of the vote. The labor unions, things they were pushing for in the 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of these will come through. African Americans groups, the progressive movement is kind of be a mix. We're going to have some success with the Niagara movement and W. Du Bois. There will be some step backs when we get to what happened under Woodrow Wilson, but a lot of it is going to lay the ground for the future. We're going to have, because of the immigrant surge, and this is where the settlement houses for what they were doing for it. Big area that we're going to be focused on in just a few minutes will be with the media, the muckrakers, but because there was the increase in magazines and newspapers, we're going to have more things that are exposed. The corruption of the political machines, that backlash is going to continue. We're going to have more and more laws in government there. We're going to have a disagreement with the idea of socialism when it comes for corporations and the idea of monopolies, and then we're going to have this anti-monopoly movement there. A lot of things on the income, both the economy. Overall, the economy was great when we go from the end of the Civil War all the way to the Great Depression, but we did have times that we did have these big drops in it. So what are some things to kind of help that on there? And then one of the biggest focuses will be that income gap between the very rich and the very poor. All right, muckrakers is a major part that you need to know. The original term was coined by Teddy Roosevelt. He did not mean it as a compliment. If you know of muck, it's kind of like if you are cleaning a stable, a mixture of the mud, the manure, the urine, all stepped in together. And so this is where, when he said it, it was kind of a derogatory term, but they took pride in it. It's kind of like sometimes like when Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters deplorables, or when someone's called a redneck, and people take pride in that. There was a lot of them that were writing in newspapers and magazines. 2 of the women's magazines, McClure's and Collier's, would run exposés. That's a French word. It's basically for you're exposing something, but this is where we call it investigative journalism today. We'll have some books that were written. These were in our last unit there with Sister Carrie there. But 2 that you need to know, one in particular, How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. We watched the part from America's Story of Us, and then where he took the photographs of that. That is one I'll say is probably the second most used on EOC exams. Shame of the Cities with Lincoln Steffens. The EOC hasn't used that as directly as many times, but a lot of the ideas and the muckrakers, and it's kind of the same idea as Jacob Riis and that divide that we have between the rich and the poor. This picture has been used. It's used a lot of times on things. This is where in America's Story of Us they recreated this, but we're in this picture Jacob Riis shot, and just showing how the poor, 7 people in this one little area kind of stuffed in together. All right, Ida Tarbell will write a book called The History of Standard Oil Company. It'll be against monopolies and the idea that competition is good for Americans. And what happens with this is we will eventually have a lawsuit that will break up Standard Oil Company. History has repeated itself. We're actually right now where we have the Congress is looking at doing things that are against where they think it's monopolistic practices of Amazon and Google and Facebook. But the idea is that we need to be able to have more competition. And then where she wrote about how John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil just crushed anybody that we have. I know in class kind of was given an example more like how Amazon, if you're selling online, you almost have to go through Amazon for a lot of products. But if you have a product that sells really good, but Amazon can make it, they might go and make their own product that's now a rival of yours, and then their product's going to come up on the search engine. The History of Standard Oil Company and Ida Tarbell's book is probably number 3 on the most common for the EOC exam. The number 1 is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Make sure that you know this. This book was written about, and he was talking about the meat packing plants there. In Unit 6, we went over the idea of caveat emptor, which means the buyer beware. Well, this will change things, and we'll have some parts that we'll read, and you could have a part on the EOC exam that they have. I vividly remember a part that I was reading that was talking about where the giant vats that are grinding up the meat that would be making like sausages or hot dogs, and there's rats that are running around. If the rat has some poison in the mouth and it falls down into this vat, it gets ground up, the poison gets ground up there. And so in the past, if you would have eaten some of that rat poison and got sick, well, caveat emptor, that was the risk you took. But to see the effects of this book, you see it was written in 1906. Before the end of the year, there were 2 laws that were passed, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act there, which both of them are pretty straightforward, that they are trying to make sure that we have the safety when it comes to meat, foods, drugs on there, where I said that you have about 10 to 12 laws that you have to know. Those are 2 of those, which are pretty straightforward, but they come about because of the jungle. Now the picture on the top right, that does not give away what the book is about. One time the EOC had that picture on there. One time there was a reading on it. One time there's a picture like this, which is kind of showing us some meat packing plants there. But it said the jungle might be the biggest one. And again, you can see the direct effect of the jungle with those laws that are passed. This political cartoon is of Standard Oil Company, and you'll see on the top where Standard Oil's there. It's got the tentacles around the Capitol and the White House there, and it looks like senators or representatives that are all basically in control of Standard Oil, and that's part of the anti-monopoly movement there. On the EOC, we've had a lot of different cartoons over time about the Standard Oil and political cartoons on this. You would not have a question like this on your EOC because they don't have accept type questions. I just like to have this because realistically these are the 4 books that you do need to know, and there are authors that they have in here. The one wrong one is The Jungle in here. All right, social gospel we had in the last unit. There's going to be the effects of it, and most of these are middle class women or richer women. They're Protestant. When you see gospel, you should be thinking church. They were ones that wanted to be Christian or Christ-like, and Christ was one that was with, not the rich and famous, he was with trying to help out the people that were the lowest in society. And so these women will be working in it. Many of them are going to be working in the settlement houses. A lot of them are going to be in these different movements that we're going to see in the progressive era. Ida Tarbell with the anti-monopoly movement there, she was one with that idea, and that we need to have something for the common person. The suffrage movement we're going to go into a lot in this section, and later on the temperance movement. A lot of these women that worked in the settlement houses, they were able to develop leadership roles, which they will then use that into some of these other movements. And this is where we're going to see the 18th and the 19th Amendments come about. We're going to see some of these court cases against monopolies that come about from here. For African Americans, the progressive movement has some successes, but also there were some downfalls. We'll see some of the steps back in the next section with President Wilson's presidency. here's where we have three different African Americans that state standards say you need to know. We had Booker T. Washington earlier. You may remember him. He's founded the Tuskegee Institute. He's one that I told you that don't look at it in the eyes of today, but look in that past. Because sometimes today people look and say, how could he not fight for 100% equality? But you must remember that he was a freed slave in the segregated South. So he preached that they would have to go by steps and earn this, but he also backed that up where he founded the Tuskegee Institute and helping African Americans to become more educated there. The next person is W. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois will found the Niagara movement, and the Niagara movement will eventually develop into the NAACP. The NAACP is founded in 1909. A lot of their success is going to be in the future. Most of you know of Rosa Parks. She was the secretary for the NAACP. The Brown versus Board of Education case came about there from the NAACP. So a lot of the civil rights movement that we're going to see in the 50s and the 60s is from this group that starts in the early 1900s. One success that they did have was they had it where grandfather clauses were removed in most places there. That was where it was one of the obstacles to voting, where if your grandfather couldn't vote, you're not allowed to vote. The third guy is more of an international person. It's the picture there on the right-hand side is Marcus Garvey. He's actually Jamaican. He had a worldwide movement. It was called the Back to Africa movement, which he wanted to have a separate area there. Again, he was trying to have for where Britain and France and Germany had the imperialism over Africa, to give those sections back, and then have people in the Americas, not just the United States, but the Americas, be able to go back and have their own countries there. It will not have much support. You kind of think that for African Americans, they didn't want to go back to Africa. They weren't from Africa. Their ancestors were, but they weren't. They were Americans. They wanted to have equality there. But the idea of the separation movement is going to come back again, and this is where in the 1960s when we had groups like the Black Panthers. So we'll have more about Marcus Garvey when we get to the 1920s there. But Washington, Du Bois, Garvey are three of the African American leaders that you're going to need to know with him. Du Bois's Niagara. The suffrage movement. This is not something that just appeared in the progressive movement. It had been building for a long time. We can actually even go further back than this, but in here, because you thinking of even the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and Abigail Adams had written to John Adams and said, "Remember the ladies." In the 1840s, we'll have the Seneca Falls Convention. We will have a big push for women's rights. They will join together with the abolitionists and make the abolition of slavery a focus. The men did not follow up on their promise to try to get women the right to vote there. From Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony in the last half of the century will be fighting and be the major leader, arrested multiple times for trying to get the right to vote there, and it will keep building during the late 1800s. One reason why it will build is more and more women were becoming educated in universities, and this is where we have states that were already allowing women to vote, Wyoming being the first, and finding that there wasn't anything derogatory with that. So this movement will try to make it more nationwide, not just in the West. The South and the East were the two areas that didn't have much votes. Now, Susan B. Anthony's will pass away in the early 1900s. Carrie Chapman Catt will be one that kind of picks up the banner for where she is at. She's the leader of the National Women's Suffrage Association. A rival group is going to be the National Women's Party. They have a lot of the same ideas, but we're going to find that more the older women are going to be part of the NAWSA, while the National Women's Party will be more younger women. Alice Paul is going to be the leader. Will be controversial at that time as one that unfortunately a lot of people don't know the background of her and what she did. Some of the National Women's Party had been in Britain, where at the same time that British women were fighting for the right to vote, they were a lot more violent in some of their actions, and some of these younger women in America wanted to do some of the same things there, and so that's why there was some rivalry between these groups. But Alice Paul will be one that will push for this. During World War I, they will have a lot of women that are arrested for where they're each day going in front of the White House and having banners. They will be, again, going to prison for this. Some of them, including Alice Paul, will have hunger strikes. And Alice Paul, they're afraid she was going to die and become a martyr. They will go and they will puree her food and force feed her there. But this is where it'll be a push there to get the 19th Amendment and getting the right to vote. After that, though, Alice Paul will continue on. She's going to be pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment. That's what ERA is. And there's going to be some support for it in the 1920s. It will fade into the background with the Great Depression and later on World War II, and we'll come back to it in the 1960s, and this is where there will be a push to have this amendment to the Constitution, and it'll nearly pass, but it won't pass there. But for the 19th Amendment, it will pass. 1920 will be the first election for that women are able to vote in nationwide. That is why we recently had for Kamala Harris that she, when giving her victory speech after winning the 2020 election, she wore an all-white outfit, because you're going to see pictures of a lot of times that the suffragettes are going to be wearing a white outfit, and then you'll get used to seeing the sashes, and then you see the pictures of the sashes. Normally they're purple stripe in it. Now, once women got the right to vote, men were scared because some men were Republicans, some were Democrat, and they were afraid that women would truly be a one party. But that ended up not happening in there. And what we found, and this is where in government we study political socialization, the majority of women voted the same as how their husbands and their fathers did. And even today, the number one factor you have for political socialization is your family. And 85% of people usually end up voting or being politically active like their family. 19th Amendment is one that gave women suffrage in here. There were anti-suffrage movement also, and this is where for the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, I'm going to be showing you a scene from that of a parade that they were attacked. There was violence against the women there, but that's where, and that one goes through a whole lot of scenes of what Alice Paul and some of the other ones from National Women's Party that went to. We're going to have a reading of some of the things that the anti-suffragists had. If you want to have a really good movie for your extra credit movie there, Iron-Jawed Angels is a really good movie for showing for what the suffrage did. I'll be showing a couple of different parodies in here. Alright, for labor changes, this is where, and I had shown the scene from American Story Bus, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, but this is where there are going to be a lot of pushes for safety. It's unfortunate sometimes it takes a fire like that and have that many people that are killed, but we will have a push for a lot of factory safety. This is where the power of the unions that we studied before will come about. For Taylorism and scientific management, we'll come back more to this in the 1920s section there, but the idea of efficiency, we're going to see some of it when we look at the government here in the next section. And then Henry Ford, the assembly line there, even though it was Henry Olds that actually did more for inventing it, but Henry Ford will perfect it there. And this is where in the 1920s and what is done in the teens and the 20s, and when we look at the economic side. For child labor, the unions again are involved there. They will push. Now they're pushing for try to have less child labor, but we'll have an act called the Keating-Owen Act that will be passed in 1916. It's going to be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but after it's declared unconstitutional, they'll break it apart and most everything will be done. There'll be a push for more mandatory schooling, not just for the safety of children, but again, unions that were wanting to not have them as competition for their working on the chat. A lot of times you'll have some pictures about child labor. These are some of the famous pictures, especially ones working in the mills here. All right, temperance. Once again, something that just didn't come back in the early 1900s. We will have, I believe it's the 1840s even, we will have the first state that becomes a dry state in Maine. And we're going to go with some of these terms when we get to the 1920s and see some of the things that end up happening there when we have dry and wets and some of the slang that is done. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union will emerge as one of the biggest groups in the late 1800s, early 1900s that'll push to get alcohol outlawed. Again, a lot of these were women that worked in the settlement houses and they saw the effects of alcohol in here. The 18th Amendment is going to pass in 1920, which the 18th Amendment says it's allowed. The Volstead Act will actually be an enforcement of it. So you could not buy, sell, transport alcohol, but you could make your own. So it wasn't that alcohol was totally illegal, but you would have to make your own. You just could not then sell it to someone else there. Why was it approved? We're going to look a lot into that when we get to the 1920s and see what were the successes of Prohibition and the reasons why it ended up ultimately failing there. And this is where we'll kind of look and see for businesses that wanted to make sure that people that worked in the factories, that we had less people that were drunk on work or missing work and hangovers and less accidents. We're going to have the effects for women when it comes that they're pushing and things for infidelity and children born out of wedlock there. For reasons that will be pushing for violence that we have. The one thing that you will see that is part of this was there is going to be a big push for this because of a factor of immigrants. Since a lot of these new immigrants were from Italy or Russia or Greece and areas that were known to drink a lot more, there was that aspect that would also help to get this passed there in 1920.